Hello, I'm Bob Trubshaw. I want to talk to you today about place names. Part of the talk is going to be explaining how some of our Old English place names are descriptive and describe hills and valleys and watercourses, and that's all sort of fairly well established stuff, accepted by the relevant academics. I also want to float an idea that was actually suggested by one of those academics, but she never actually put it into writing and so forth, and that is how we could use place names to help us get about, sort of, if you like, verbal maps. But if that sounds confusing, well, I'll try and explain it better later. Anglo-Saxons definitely got about. I mean, for a start, they came over from the continent and landed on mostly the eastern shores of England using boats. There's even an Old English poem called The Seafarer, and some of the last lines say, Utten hui huken, where we ham again, and then gethinken who we thither komen, which, translated by Nicholas Howe, reads, let us consider where we have a home, and then think how we might go there. All good stuff that we can relate to today, I think. Now, the one thing that Anglo-Saxons didn't use was maps. I certainly didn't use satnavs either. But they obviously managed to work out how to get around without getting lost. So how did they do it? Well, they might have used something like these so-called stick charts used by traditional people in Micronesia. Basically, they're on small boats that have got to get between some remarkably small islands across open water. And they do it mostly by navigating by the direction of the waves, how close the waves are together, and just how those different wave patterns interact with each other. I mean, the islands themselves influence the wave patterns, so if you were a physicist, you'd probably say that you've got interference patterns, but I don't think that's quite how Micronesians think of it. But they do create these wonderful works of art, which are obviously very functional, made of wood, a few pebbles on them, and so if they dropped over the side of one of their little boats, then it would float on the water and you'd pick it up again. And clearly they work. These are a continuing tradition of how they get about. The Inuit up in Greenland also had something physical in the way of maps. They had these carved sticks in the later 19th century, and they're carved in a way which is an exaggerated depiction of the inlets and headlands associated with key part of the Greenland coastline. If they look a bit chunky and so forth, well, you might be in the dark and you might have to feel these maps, which is what they have to call them, through big fur mittens and so forth. But again, if you happen to drop one of these from up the side of your kayak, they will float. Right, the other side of the world in Australia, they have plan-like views of ancestral journeys, the so-called Dreamtime songs. We tend to call these Dreamtime songs the song lines. It's not a term originally used by the Australian people in any way. It was a term invented by Bruce Chapman in the 1980s and used it as the title of a novel based around anthropologists in the Australian outback. A lot of people have taken this book as being sort of more factual anthropology. There's no great huge factual errors in it, but Chapman sort of conflated a lot of different people and a lot of different tribes, I think, to get a simplified idea of what he calls songlines, and brought them to everybody's attention, which they really hadn't happened before. The Australian Aborigines also have map-like depictions of journeys. They don't sort of carry sheets of paper with them or anything like that. They don't carry very much with them at all. But one thing an Australian chap will be carrying as he travels around is his spear and his spear thrower. And what's happened here is that the handle of the spear thrower has been inscribed with this somewhat stylised map. It's stylised in the same sort of way that the London Underground map is stylised, I suppose. And what it's depicting are all the waterholes across about 100 miles of the Gibson Desert. Now, never got any personal experience of Australian deserts, but I honestly don't think you would survive walking across 100 miles of Australian desert if you didn't know exactly where the waterholes were. So this is a fairly key item of passing on cultural knowledge, geographical knowledge, and yes, it's a linear thing because these journeys are fairly linear, but it's represented as a stylised map. Let's now look at how maps originate within European culture. First of all, we're looking at the 13th century, and they are linear in exactly the same way as the Australian Aborigine. Here we just sort of start top left and work through the columns towards the right, and I'm not quite sure which part of the journey this is, but it's showing the key towns and river crossings and so forth if you want to travel from London to Jerusalem. And a lot of people did in the 13th and 14th century, and this map was frequently reproduced, not by printing, just by drawing it out again and again, and various copies have survived. Come the 17th century, and printing has been invented and is being used, but they're doing essentially the same thing. This, published in 1675, shows, well, remarkably, the journey from Hereford to Leicester. I'm just wondering how many people in the 17th century needed to travel backwards and forwards between Hereford and Leicester, but seemingly they did. It was worth publishing the map. And we can see here its strip effect. Now, I've used Google to create a version of this same map, and quite an interesting route through the Worcester and Stratford-on-Avon and picking up the Fossway into Leicester. The Anglo-Saxons were describing areas of land. When you transferred land, there was a charter to convey, well, let's call it ownership of that land. I'm oversimplifying things. And it defined a boundary. So it's a linear sequence of physical places that you could walk between, and clearly from time to time people did walk these boundaries. This is an example. Arast on Eswalders Law, Thon on Gimotbury, Thon on Settlethorn, Thon on Littlenbury, Thon on Gadham, Thon on Athelgaithers Stenu, Don on Weedenbar, Don on Weedenley, Don on Wolferbury, Don between and Twyam Beorum, Don on People's Hole, Don on Mechbura, Don on Pispa, and so it goes on. It refers to a place called Derrentune, which is probably now known as Durrington, which is in Sussex, and translated first to Esquold's Tumulus, then to Moot Mound, then to Settlethorn, then to Little Hill, then to Goat Meadow, then to Ethelgifer's Valley, then to the Wide Wood or Clearing, then to Wolf's Burial Mound, then between two mounds or hills, then to Pebble's Hole or Hollow Place, and then to the Boundary Hill, and then to Pispa, which we don't quite know what it translates as, and we don't really know what a Settlethorn is either. It was dated 28th of May, 934, and that's King Ethelstan gifting this 12 hides of land to Elfwald, and he built a minster on the land. Larger areas of land were also defined in exactly the same way. This is in translation the definition of the creation of the Danelaw by King Alfred in 878. It follows the Watling Street for a big part of the boundary, where the ditch runs into Watling Street, along Watling Street to the ford, then along the brook to the other ford, then from that ford up to the spring, and thence into the valley, then from the valley to the ditch, from the ditch to the second ditch, then from that ditch to the brook, then from the brook to Kimberwell, then along the ditch to Eastcote, which is near Toaster, and thence to the Old Brook, up from the Old Brook parallel with a little stream, then straight up to the highway, along the highway to the ditch, along the ditch to Watling Street. People have attempted to identify which ditch was which ditch, completely failed because the ditches of the 9th century aren't the ditches of even the 20th century. So it made sense then, but sadly it makes no practical sense now. Just occasionally, the boundaries on these charters, when they survive, can be identified. And here it looks like we're looking at a ditch, isn't it? But actually, it's not the ditch in the foreground, nor the watercourse just beyond it, both of which actually are not ditches. They're the upper reaches of the River Avon. This is the Wiltshire Avon that flows down towards the Solent, and the water in the sea here will flow on by the side of Stonehenge and through the middle of another Megahenge at Marden. The actual boundary is that rather scrappy-looking hedge in the background, and that is what was mentioned in something like a 9th century charter, and it still forms the parish boundary between the two parishes of North Newton and Manningford. This same sense of linearity comes through in the Middle English literature as well. The first few stories that actually come down to us, famously, of course, Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. The whole of the Canterbury Tales, the framing story of Canterbury Tales, if you like, is about a journey on pilgrimage from London to Canterbury. And obviously it depicted the way that people travelling such distances told stories to each other. And that's the context of all these tales that are being retold and being written down by Chaucer. So we have to think of, quintessentially, journeys being a time to tell stories to you, people who are with you. You will travel with company just only for protection, if not just for the greater pleasure of having somebody to chat to. Another early example of Middle English literature is William Langland's Visions of Pier Plowman. And although the vision is not entirely about a journey, it was inspired by a journey which Langland took from Shropshire to London, and this vision that he writes about took place during that journey while he was on the Malvern Hills. And so again, we have to see that the whole thing about journeying is integral to Middle English literature. And again, the author, who we don't know the name of, who wrote a wonderful poem called The Pearl, so he's referred to as the Pearl poet, and he also wrote this rather wonderful tale of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. So just a summary of the opening section. Sir Gawain sets off from Snowdonia, keeping all the Isles of Anglesey on his left. He then crosses over at a ford at the Holyhead. Now clearly this is not Holyhead on Anglesey. It could either be the place that we know as Holywell near Flint, associated with St Winifred, or the site of the Poulton Abbey near Pulford, both of which had relics of holy heads. The full story and hagiography of St Winifred is very much about her losing her head, but still carrying it back to Holywell. Sir Gawain then carries on to the Wirral and eventually arrives at the castle of the Green Knight. So let's look at descriptive place names. This is formerly the Gravelly Hill interchange. Well, that's descriptive in its own right. It's before they put all this concrete on it, it was obviously hills distinctive for being gravelly. We actually know this interchange much better as Spaghetti Junction, which is also descriptive, although in a metaphoric way rather than a literal way. The old English people did pretty much the same thing. Here we are just south of Swindon, and we're looking at a village called Chiseldon. Now, actually, that's a sort of a corruption of its original form. It was originally Chiseldene, so not Don a hill, but Dean a valley. And chisel here is the Old English word for gravel. So this was the Gravelly Valley, quite the Gravelly Hill. And it's the same word, chisel, that gives us Chesil Beach, famous for all the small stones and cobbles and so forth, which make up its length. So a purely descriptive name, although modern people wouldn't necessarily recognise chisel as being the Old English word for gravel, so it's become just a proper name. So in the 1980s, a lady called Margaret Gelling, professional place name researcher, academic, started looking at the descriptive names in Old English and began to realise that these words were not interchangeable, they were not synonyms, but each name referred to a specific shape of hill. Umbury means rounded hill. Here we're looking at somewhere which is almost on that journey from Hereford to Leicester, Inkbarrow. The original sense of the word, it's been corrupted over the centuries, but inters rounded hills. It was actually plural. Here we're looking at the church at Inkbarrow, sitting on one of those rounded hills. So buries have a very specific shape. Here's another bury. This is Shuckborough, Warwickshire. Shuck is a term for supernatural or preternatural, paranormal beings. Let's just sort of conveniently translate it as the goblins rounded hill. Cliff, as in Clifton. Here we're looking at the Clifton in Oxfordshire, but there are plenty of other examples. I'm quite close to the one that now forms a suburb of Nottingham. Cliff is what it sounds like. The sense of the word hasn't changed, so this is the town, the settlement, associated with a fairly steep cliff. Here's a slightly more complicated one. This is Lechlade, down in Gloucestershire, where the road crosses the River Thames, but it's also at the confluence with the River Leach. The Leach being the Lech, and the Lade part being from the Old English word Gilad, a difficult river crossing. Margaret here has turned up and taken this photograph at a time when the Thames was in flood, so a particularly difficult time to cross. In the medieval period, there's a rather long causeway created, and that is still the crossing point to the south of Lechlade, and a little bit of a bottleneck for holiday traffic. So Lechlade originally meant difficult crossing of the Leach, or difficult crossing of the Thames near the River Leach. Other ones were descriptive at one time. Southwest Leicestershire, almost on the borders with Warwickshire, we have Fenny Drayton. Well, the Fenny means pretty much what it means, boggy land. And dray becomes the modern English word drag. So this is a town, a settlement, associated with dragging people through the boggy land. Think of sledges or something like that. Of course, if you know your terminology for horse-drawn farm carts and so forth, then dray becomes a particular type of wheeled transport. But I think it evolves out of an earlier form of transport that was dragged rather than wheeled. The implication is that this settlement, this town, was there to provide help to get travellers through the boggy place. And they sort of didn't have to pay any other taxes except provide this assistance. And you can see from this OS map that the Roman road just got a little bit of a dogleg in as you go through the village. But I do wonder if that was the especially boggy place in Anglo-Saxon times. Later people have just simply done a bit of a detour. Okay, so let's look a little bit more intensely at place names. Various ways of constructing them. Quite a lot of them describe places where people were living at the time, so we call them habitative names, endings such as Ham and Toon and Worth and Wick and Port, but by, the by ending, Thorpes, probably different from each other, at least at the time when the names were coined, so we think that a Ham was more likely to be associated with pastoral farming, and a Toon, at least initially, would have set up to be more arable, but there would have been an overlap. The Harms would have needed some arable and the Toons would have needed some pastoral. Worth seemed to be on boundaries. Some very recent research suggests that places like Blideth and Raineth and Dysworth and so forth are all associated with being near to county boundaries usually. Wicks are something else. They are trading places, and so were ports. And you say, well, ports still are. Well, yes, but ports originally weren't something you expected to encounter on the coast or river estuaries. They could be inland. The difference was that a port was a trading place authorised by the king, and therefore he would be getting tolls and taxes, whereas a wick was something much more informal and probably trying to dodge such royal taxes. So the wicks initially were going to be a bit like a Sunday car boot, and the ports were more like the weekly market that's always taken place in the market town. Byes and Thorpes we know have to be really 10th century into the 11th century because they're both Scandinavian words, and we often see as ending by, replacing Hams and Toons. And Thorpes we know are daughter settlements, usually set up for arable farming, so they usually pop up between older place names, and quite often they become deserted medieval villages by 15th century and so forth, because they were on the more marginal land, the water supply was more erratic, so people sort of gave up on them if times got bad. Sometimes we find that the Ham and the Toon and so forth at the end is preceded by ing and something like that, and that signifies that it's the people of, the followers of, the descendant of, and we can be almost certain that the first part of that name would be a personal name. So first one that comes to my mind is Thrussington in Leicestershire. So it was the tune of the followers of somebody called Trusser or something like that. So alongside habitative names, we have descriptive names. And sometimes a descriptive name can also be habitative, have harm or tune or something like that at the end of it, but more typically they don't. They end in words like Don and Dean, and we've already realised these can be confused, as the word for a particular type of woodland, den, can creep in and so forth. Moors and meres and merks also get confused down the centuries. Moors were originally quite watery, meres definitely are watery, whereas a merk is actually a boundary. So sometimes the same word can appear in a modern place name, spelling modernised, and you're not really sure where it comes from. You do need to consult the very early forms, usually Domesday, 1086 or earlier, to really make sense of Old English place names. You cannot rely on the modern forms at all. I did say that Margaret Gellinger come up with quite a surprising number of words just for hills in Old English, and these are not synonyms. Hill, Hyll, is the catch-all. It's the description for hills that don't quite look like the other types of hills, and that's almost certainly the reason why it became the modern English word for a hill, obviously. Dons and downs, well, the South Downs, the North Downs, yes, they're all very hilly. Cliff is obvious, shelf is pretty obvious, ridge, edge, side. Ness, it signifies a headland, although quite often, as with Skegness, the headland's actually eroded away, but somewhere like Orford Ness, of course, is very much a ness. Tors we only encounter around Dartmoor and so forth. These are rocky summits to otherwise quite modest hills. Knolls, I think we would recognise. Copse and lows. Overs and hoes are very specific. Over is one version of the spelling. Regionally variant is oro instead of over. Here we are, near my former home at Avebury, looking not so much at the Neolithic Stone Row Avenue in the foreground, but actually the middle skyline where those beech trees are. And we have the particular ridge there of Overton Hill. And the village of Overton is lost in the mist in the valley. And this is a very good example of what an over looks like. Somebody described it as being like an upturned canoe, and you're just looking at the prow of the canoe sort of disappearing, well, up to nothing really, as it drops into the valley. And that's what we've got here. Most of the Overtons that I know around Leicestershire, the hill profile is there, but it's lost by more dense clumps of trees and by modern housing and so forth, so you don't see the hill shape quite so clearly. Hoe is an even more intriguing one. Margaret Gelling's own description of it, they were heel-shaped. But you've got to understand, this is a giant-sized foot, and the giant is lying face down. So what you're looking at is the heel and the sole of the foot. That's how she described hoes, and it pretty much worked for most of them. Okay, lost in the trees here, but this is Tysoe, a hill right on the Oxfordshire and Warwickshire border. So this is the hoe of a deity called Tew. Yes, Tew, who gives us Tuesday, and in a slightly variant spelling also gives us Tesco's. Now, if you think that's enough words for hill in Old English, well, you're wrong. They also use words like peak and up and hefford, which means head, and bile, which means beak, heap, which makes sense, doesn't it? Hat, the specific name for concave hillsides, hlith, hrigs, and Hurst, which is a wooded hill, and we'll encounter Hurst again when we talk about names for woodland. Every one of these, to an Old English speaker, was a distinctive shape, as were the names for valleys. And yes, one of those words, vale, has come down to modern English. We recognise what a bottom might be as well. A corf is a fairly narrow pass. Corfe Castle is one of the best examples. A clough, a chine, well, somewhere down Bournemouth way I think we've got several chines. A dale, There's one of these examples of a dale in Leicestershire, which is called Ragdale, which is originally Rakedale, a very narrow, rake-like valley. We're familiar with deans because they're the sort of shallow valleys. Combes are also short, but they're usually blocked at one end. So you typically only encounter combes in chalk uplands and so forth. We can get secluded valleys, which are known as a hope. Glens, which are shallow valleys. And sometimes they can be so shallow you're not really aware that you're in the valley, and this is the area around Great Glen to the south of Leicester. You've really got to look at a map to realise that, yes, you know, you cross the little stream that is actually the River Glen, but the valley is, it almost seems like it's flat all around you. Another type of deep ravine-like valley is a gill, and another one with steep hillsides is a ganipa, and that comes down to us as the name of the village of Nipton, northeast Leicestershire. And I just love the one called Snock, hills that project out. These words get corrupted, of course. So in the parish of Great Rollright on the Oxfordshire-Warwickshire borders, there's an example of a dean, but it's now called Dane's Bottom, because quite clearly not only was it a dean, but it was also thought to be a bottom, and it just got corrupted from dean to Danes. I can assure you that no Vikings were mooning in that particular valley. It is just a corruption of two Old English words. Won't surprise you that there are lots of different words for woodland. One of them was woodoo, which evolves into the modern English word wood. Barrow, sacred grove. A den, a graf or grove, probably sacred. We're not quite sure if all of them were. Hurst we've encountered before because that's a wooded hill. We also get various spellings which are pronounced shore. Well, my surname, for example, Trubshaw, refers to a place in Staffordshire, close to the potteries, and the shore, the linear wood, the wood on the boundary, associated with somebody called Trubber. And if you think about it, we still use the word like seashore, spelt differently, but actually with the same meaning. This is the liminal zone between land and sea, is the seashore. And this shore, there was the woodland, which was on the boundary, probably between two different parishes. We also get the word wold, which usually gets spelt in modern English with an O, not an A. So we have the Leicestershire wolds, we have the Lincolnshire wolds, the Cotswolds, and actually the Weald, Kent and Sussex, is also originally wold, but they pronounced it slightly differently, so it's come down to us as the Weald. It originally meant woodland with some clearings in, those clearings probably being arable, but then the clearings got bigger and bigger, and you ended up with an arable area with clumps of woodland in it, but that's how farming practices just evolve. A frith, probably a sanctuary wood, that's the sense that frith carries later. The word holt, it seems to refer to woodland with just a single species of trees, so highly managed, deliberately planted. Lunda is a Scandinavian word which means grove. We may again assume that these may have been sacred groves. And skoga, which I can't think of any actual examples to my acquaintance, but they're obviously out there. What's slightly confusing is that some of these words, like Lee, refer to woodland, but they seem originally to have referred to a clearing in a wood. So clearly you can't have a clearing in a wood without a wood, so there's a bit of ambiguity there. And quite plausibly, the clearing in the wood became overgrown, so there was just the wood. In early examples, Lee seems to be a clearing. In later Old English usage, it seems to be a wood, and we can never quite be sure. And in that boundary charter, you may have picked up that a wood or a clearing. We can't translate them reliably. Scandinavians come along, and they find clearings in woods, and they call them roths and thwaites. And in Leicestershire, we have a village called Rothley, which is tautological. It's a Scandinavian roth combined with the Old English Lee, quite clearly was indisputably there by the 10th century. Thwaite, of course, we tend to associate with West Yorkshire in particular as a place name, but again referring to a clearing. And West Yorkshire at the time would have been quite heavily wooded. It isn't now, but that's in recent centuries. Okay, another long list here. This is watery places. Yes, the Old English word pool carries on in modern use. Bath, an artificial pool. Weller, yes, of course, in modern English we have wells, but in Old English it didn't mean a hole into the ground which you put a bucket down or something like that. A weller is the modern sense of spring, water issuing naturally to the surface, and actually weller also refers to the first few yards of the water running off. Old English borrowed the Latin word funta to mean a font, and we seem to think that these probably were lead cisterns, if you like, left over from late Roman Britain, and which were put into use possibly as liturgical baptismal places, but the evidence really isn't there. This is the example of one of the funta place names. This is Mottisfont in Hampshire. Now, we're not looking at a lead line cistern here. We're looking at a very modern arrangement, a fairly attractive arrangement around the natural water source. You have to assume that there was some sort of font-like construction at the time that the place name was created. In chalky areas you'll find bournes and winter bournes and so forth, seasonal streams, and the water is usually clear. Around the English Midlands you'll find lots of brooks, and usually muddy because of the boulder clays or glacial tills, whatever you wish to call them. I already mentioned that meres are areas of open water, as in sort of northwestern England is a moss. Marsh, we know exactly what they're about. Wass and Fleet and Pill and Seath are also open areas. Fleet has some connotation of flash floods, of fleeting water, water that appears fleetingly. Seath means, fairly indisputably, a sacred pool. We have an interesting place name on the Leicestershire Wolds called Seagrave, which is the Seath Grave. So the sacred pool in the grove, a sacred grove. The pool isn't there anymore, but if you look at an OS map, it's fairly clear where the pool would have been, and one of the roads out the village now passes through that. Because of the transitions between Old English and Modern English, a lot of the names I've been just describing in the last few minutes aren't that blindingly obvious. Just a few are, like hill and vale and so forth, but mostly we've lost the original sense. Like chisel, we wouldn't pick that up automatically unless you have some knowledge of Old English. As the colonial process evolved around the world, we named places, and these remain transparent. Chinaman's Knob in Victoria. You don't have to explain that one. Yorkie's Knob, I do have to explain, because we know it was named after a fisherman who came from Yorkshire, who was George Lawson, but known as Yorkie Lawson. So, yes, fine. Knob, obviously here being another way of describing a hill, promontory. Wright Creek, also in Queensland. Well, I haven't been able to find out who the Mr. Wright was, but I think we can assume that there was a Mr. or just possibly a Mrs. Wright. And the same with Gordon Vale and so forth. And while we're in Australia, let's just look at some of the Aboriginal names which have survived into modern usage. Cooliananobbing. It's just a proper name now, but it originally meant large hard rocks. And that's very descriptive, because those large hard rocks were actually very iron-rich iron ore, and that is one heck of a source for iron ore for smelting. North America, the same. We can go to Minnesota and find Bayview Heights and Chubb Lake, and I think we know what we're going to encounter if we did. If we go along Lake Superior waterline to the northeast, we find two harbours, which is conveniently between two bays, a Black River and a Silver Creek, a Split Rock Lighthouse. Now, how descriptive do you need to get? And whether you actually encounter beavers at Beaver Bay anymore, well, that's an open question, but at the time it got its name. Clearly they were distinctive. And if you go to the south shore of Lake Superior, we find Redcliffe and Minersville and Porcupine Mountains. I hope the porcupines are still happily living in the Porcupine Mountains. North and South Dakota and Idaho, we can encounter Eagle Butte, Valley City, Twin Falls, and in the East Midlands. At one point, you could have encountered an Eagle Nook, a valley town, and if not actually twin falls, at least two fords. And these are, in Old English, Ernhall, Denoughton and Twyford. And yes, they come down as the town of Arnold to the north of Nottingham. Denton, one I'm thinking of, is to the southwest of Grantham, but there are several others in the country. There are several Twyfords as well. I can think first of one to the south of Melton Mowbray on the journey down to Market Harborough. Okay, so I'm going to start speculating a bit here. Let's just focus in on a little group of descriptive place names. And these basically are consecutive villages, starting south of Leicester at Great Glen and going all the way through to the east of Leicestershire and the Rutland border, a place called Thistleton. I don't know quite why you'd want to go between Great Glen and Thistleton, and it's not the most direct route either, but I'm just using it to demonstrate that you can have a journey where every village name is descriptive. Great Glen, it's not the glen that is great here, it's just a wide, shallow valley. It's the settlement was a royal estate centre, which why it became known as Great Glen. Stretton is the tune on the street, and street has a very specific meaning in Old English. It refers to former Roman roads. Houghton on the Hill is one of these Hoe place names, the heel-shaped hill. Obviously the Houghton on the Hill is now tautological, but these things happen. Newton is the new settlement, of course, and it was new in about the 10th century, but why change the name? Twyford, we've just discussed. Just on from there is Borough on the Hill, and that has a very dramatically situated Iron Age hill fort, the Burr, the earthworks. Pickwell is a well on the peak. A rather unusual place to find a natural source of water, so quite distinctive. We then come to the first of two Overtons, the first one known as Cold Overton, so clearly a bit bleak. We then pass through Langham, the long settlement, the long homestead, and I think this is more to do with the shape of the parish than the shape of the settlement. On from there through Ashwell, the well, the spring with the ash tree, and then the well housing still survives. It's not Anglo-Saxon, it's probably late 18th century. We then come through a village called Barrow, which is not much of it, but it originally had a burial mound, Barrow, tumulus. We then come to the second of the Overtons, this one known as Market Overton, for the obvious reason, and then to Thistleton. And Thistletons and Nettletons both refer to former Roman settlements. Nothing really left standing, but the soil had been enriched by manure and other waste, and were particularly good for growing thistles and nettles. So that's the sort of name you've got there. So if you're following this journey, how on earth would you remember how to get from Great Glen to Twyford and the places in between? Well, I think you would use some sort of mnemonic. And there are examples in folklore. I'm going to use the example of one that's pretty dire, actually. When you actually get to it, you'll groan. But it is in Leicestershire, so that's keeping some consistency. Here we are standing on the summit of Mount Sorrel, the site of a Norman castle. Mount Sorrel itself is a Norman French place name. The hill, the mount, which is sorrel coloured, particular shade of red, which is associated with the granodiorite that is outcrops there and has been extensively quarried. And we're looking about south-east in this photograph, but if the trees weren't there, we could look due south, and we would look over a number of settlements before we actually got to Leicester. So if you missed the last bus home from drinking at Mount Sorrel and wanted to get back to Leicester, you'd have to pass through these places in the right order. How could you remember what order they come in? Well, here's a try. First of all, you've got to imagine you're a really old god called Bell, but you're riding an incredibly powerful, a magically powerful, sorrel-coloured horse. And your mates are around you, and so you make a bet that you can get all the way from Mount Sorrel to Leicester, which is about 7 miles, and your horse can do it in just 5 leaps. It becomes substance of legend. Mount Sorrel he mounted at, Rothley he rode by, one lip he leaped over, at Birstall he burst his gall, or burst his all, and at Belgrave he was buried. I told you it was dire. This is not a great example of poetry. But it introduces a narrative, it introduces a mnemonic by which you could remember that you go from Mount Sorrel to Rothley to Wanlip to Birstall to Belgrave, and then you are in the outskirts of Leicester, so you get your bearings back from there. Time doesn't allow me to go into any great detail, but Michael Dames wrote a whole book looking at the legends of Taliesin and situating them in the North Wales landscape. So this is Llyn Tegid, otherwise known as Lake Bala, which is the birthplace of Taliesin when he was still known as Gwion Bach. And then he is transformed into Taliesin in a lake called Llyn Gerionith. There's a lot else in Michael's book. It does show that quite important sets of legends are actually very much situated in places and would be a way of remembering those places and so forth. Again, the opening of Alan Garner's Widstone and Brisingamen, that also includes a long folk story about travelling around on Alderley Edge. Garner published that novel back in 1960, about 15 years ago. He also wrote a little pamphlet which explained more about those place names. This was non-fiction. Oral cultures passed on their information through stories, through legends. We also know, and it's thanks to this gentleman, Stanley Robertson, that they acquired that knowledge while they were travelling. They weren't settled people. Stanley was brought up on the road, and he was taught on the road. A woman called Sarah Roth interviewed Stanley Robertson quite extensively and wrote down a lot of what he was telling her. And one of the quotes is, as a child, Stanley remembers passing milestones on the road, annual circuit. At these places, his father would review a learning principle, asking questions to make sure that he'd understood, and I guess also asking that he'd remembered what he'd been taught at that place a year before. And if that sounds a bit fanciful, on a different occasion, Stanley told Sarah, if he was struggling to remember one of the stories, first of all, I try to remember the actual place where I heard the story, maybe Lumphahanan or someplace camping. I try to remember the setting, everything, even the smells, everything to do with the senses, which is a very good way of trying to remember complicated information. And I think European culture also had this idea of stories working together collectively. And one of the key reasons we needed a collection of such stories was to remember the order in which the constellations rose throughout the year. More predictable in the Mediterranean area, so a lot of this comes out of classical Roman and Greek culture, but the same tales come up through Northern Europe. Unless you're a fairly proficient astrologer or an astronomer, it's difficult to remember the sequence in which the constellations cycle through the skies each year. But that each of those constellations had, and to a large extent still has, a very specific legend associated with it, which explains why the two twins are up in the sky and so forth. And I think if you took those legends collectively, they would act as a mnemonic for remembering that whole sequence. We now use printing and diagrams. We have other ways of remembering almost the same information. Literally, there's a set of legends which, if you like, are as big as a galaxy. The Australian Aborigines, again, passed down their information about places orally as songs, describing their journeys, mythical journeys of the ancestors, as linear journeys, just as we were talking about right at the beginning of this talk. And I came across this, and sadly I've not been able to sort of follow through anymore. But the folk singer Chris Wood was interviewed in 2010 and said this: when that Australian songlines thing came up, that wound me up. People freaked out this amazing Australian Aboriginal thing where they don't have a map, they just sing a song and they know where they are. But Norfolk fishermen have been doing the same thing for generations. There's a song that tells you all the compass bearings and the landmarks you would need to navigate from Yarmouth to Newcastle. On Tyne, I think this one is. It's no different, but because the songlines happen in Australia, everybody's into it. The concept of anything so beautiful and rich and wonderful and canny happening here in our own country is just too much for people to get their heads around. And sadly, I can't find out what that song was, and I don't think Chris Wood has ever sort of made any effort to record it or popularise it. But I'll take it that he is talking not just about one song, but about a whole tradition that once existed of using songs to navigate. Clearly, these big stories, these whole overall sequences, haven't come down to us. But what has come down to us is folklore of specific places. And back in the 1930s, there was an archaeologist called Leslie Grinsell who was surveying burial mounds throughout England and also recording any of the folklore that he encountered. And that was really, really novel at the time. Archaeologists didn't see what the relevance of folklore was. To some extent, Leslie Grinsell's work remained a bit of an anomaly. But then in the early 1970s, a woman called Janet Board started revisiting this place-specific folklore and authored a book illustrated by her photographer husband, Colin Board, which came out under the title Mysterious Britain, and which had a huge influence on other authors, other researchers, and was the first of a great many books put together by Janet and Colin Board, most of it dealing with standing stones and henges and the folklore that went with it. Here we are at Castle Rigg in Cumberland, and she's talking about these stones are part of a memorial assembly place where kings come to mourn their dead. Standing stones, stone circles, due to attract some fairly rich folklore. Rollright stones in Oxfordshire, Warwickshire, again, quite a complex legend associated with them. So I think what Leslie Grinsell's recording, what Janet and Colin Board and other researchers were recollecting later in the 20th century was these fragments of what may have been a lot longer narratives linking together whole journeys, and kind of pastiche of them appears probably late 18th, early 19th century as this Mount Sorrel to Belgrave journey and so forth. But I would like to think that if you wanted to get from Great Glen to Thistleton and needed to remember that sequence of descriptive place names, then somebody would come up with some fairly fancy dancing and rather ridiculous story which linked them all together. And as such, people in Anglo-Saxon, early medieval England would actually be able to follow that journey. Well, just as people link together places from London to Jerusalem, they told stories on pilgrimage routes, and they certainly survived as part of the oral tradition of the Scottish travellers. And whilst we don't have the detailed information we have from Stanley Robertson, I'm sure it was true of many of the other travelling communities. And yes, they are still around, albeit rather fragmented in English and culture, English folk traditions and so forth. So let us consider where we have a home and then think how we might go there.